What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys. In today's video, we're going to be going over the wide receiver starts and sits heading into week 5. As you guys may know from earlier this week, I am a bit under the weather, getting better though. So if I sound a little bit off or the volume's a bit lower, I'm going to try to fix it in post. But overall, just wanted to give you guys a bit of a heads up on that. With that being said, and heading into week 5, this is a really important stage of the season. By now, some of you teams that drafted really strongly, you could be sitting at 4-0, maybe 3-1, knowing you could lose a couple weeks along the way, still manage to squeak into the playoffs. And with you sitting comfortably, that'll give you a bit of flexibility in making some of those tougher start and sit decisions, but we always want to, of course, help you in making the correct one. And for those teams out there that may not have gotten off to the strongest start, fear not, there still is plenty of time for you to turn it around. So if you're sitting at 1-3, even potentially 0-4, it may benefit you to look into potential trade options. But before liquidating your team or maybe even hitting that panic button, let's see how week 5 pans out. With that being said, if you enjoy our content, please be sure to hit the like button. It helps us in being able to grow the channel. And if you're new, maybe you haven't yet subscribed yet, consider subscribing today. We post videos all throughout the season. In today's video, we're going to be going through every matchup, touching base on the wide receiver position, letting you know if we would start that player or not, the relative range in which we have them ranked. But with things constantly changing, for the most up-to-date information, be sure to check out our website for the full rankings. That's available at thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that in the description box below. With that being said though, it's time to hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was among wide receivers with at least 200 receiving yards. Which player had the deepest average depth of target? The correct answer was actually Henry Ruggs. Congratulations to Chip Mayweather, the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, at Frederick Bongos. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which running back in 2021 has spent the least time on average behind the line of scrimmage? Once again, that's which running back on average in 2021 has spent the least time behind the line of scrimmage. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Now, without further ado, we have a lot of matchups to go over, so we might as well hop into it. In the first game, I can't say is going to be the most exciting game. We have the New York Jets versus the Atlanta Falcons. I believe this is the London game, so we will be taking out home road advantages. In this one, though, the Atlanta Falcons are still 2.5-point favorites. The projected total in this one on the lower end coming in at 45 points. I mentioned this not being a very exciting game because both of these offenses are on the weaker side, to say the least. The Atlanta Falcons typically have a bit more firepower, but this year not only have they vastly disappointed expectations, but Calvin Ridley, he's already been ruled out. No other wide receiver so far this year has even stepped up outside of Calvin Ridley. So when it comes to wide receivers who we would start and sit in this matchup, on the Atlanta side, there really wouldn't be any. In last week's video, somebody had asked us to include Cordell Patterson in the wide receiver projections, and if he were a wide receiver, I would feel confident starting him as a wide receiver too. That would of course have to factor in his rushing production in addition to his receiving production, because he's not going to have as much volume as a typical high-end wide receiver would. We would fully expect him to see an increase in volume with Calvin Ridley being out, but with this being a poor offense with limited scoring capabilities and the wide receiver position being as deep as we've ever seen it, Cordell Patterson, even when compared to other wide receivers, would come in as a wide receiver too. Outside of that, nothing really more needs to be said about the Atlanta Falcons. As for the New York Jets though, they do have a bit more fantasy relevant wide receivers we can discuss, mainly Corey Davis and now Jamison Crowder, who had his first game back just this past week. Having Jamison Crowder back though for Corey Davis is going to hurt his overall floor and ceiling. He is still clearly the leading wide receiver on this team though, but with this being a great matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, it would be one that we would even have Corey Davis ranked higher had Jamison Crowder not came back from his injury yet. Corey Davis in this one is going to be slotted in as a wide receiver 3. I would say a high-end one with a safe floor. Not quite as high as it would be with Jamison Crowder out of the lineup, but still a startable fantasy asset nonetheless. Speaking of Jamison Crowder, the only other wide receiver we would start in this matchup and for the New York Jets, we have him ranked outside the top 40. Even with that though, he does make a solid flex option. Presumably he has a relatively safe floor as well, at least from what we had from the one-game sample with him being back. Considering it was a one-game sample though, we do have to take it with a grain of salt, but desperate owners who did take Jamison Crowder off the waiver wire this past week should be rewarded in their first matchup with him on the team. Moving into the next one though, a bit more exciting, we have the Philadelphia Eagles on the road against the Carolina Panthers. This one has a very similar projected total coming in with 45.5 points, Carolina being a 3-point home favorite in this one. And starting with the Carolina Panthers, DJ Moore, nobody's really questioning whether or not they're starting and sitting him. He has completely popped off this year, being a consistent wide receiver 1, even having some of his best games rather recently. He'll look to continue that hot streak and has a very good chance of continuing that hot streak this week against the Philadelphia Eagles, and on paper it just seems like a meh matchup. Philadelphia at the beginning part of the season did seem like one of the better defenses at defending opposing wide receivers, but has since fallen apart. For that, DJ Moore is going going to be ranked for us as a wide receiver 1. He's been playing far too well to be ranked as anything other than that. And as for Robbie Anderson, the only real other wide receiver we would consider starting on the Carolina Panthers, you can confidently start him in the flex position. We do have him ranked just outside the top 40, but with this matchup being against the Philadelphia Eagles, a team that definitely can put up points offensively, Christian McCaffrey listed as doubtful, unlikely to play, this team is going to be looking for offensive playmakers, ones that can get behind the defense, a defense that can make mistakes. For that, Robbie Anderson, a speedster himself, he certainly will have a good chance of getting lucky even on what could be a minimal target market share. For that, as mentioned, start him in the flex. Terrace Marshall though, leave him on the bench. No other wide receiver on the Carolina side we would consider starting, so we'll move over to Philly. Rookie Devonta Smith, he's definitely worth a start. We have him ranked as a wide receiver 3, and in most matchups we'll have him ranked around in that range. He's coming off of his best game of the season with the most targets he's seen on the season in a single game. It was a 10 target performance, a game in which he caught 7 of those targets for 122 yards, and while he hasn't caught a receiving touchdown since all the way back in week 1 against Atlanta, his high floor from being the leading receiver in this offense, coupled with the lack of weapons that they have at the receiver position as well, that will help him retain his weekly fantasy value. And if you're wondering if you could trust any other Philadelphia wide receivers starting in your fantasy lineup, we would say no. The best performing one behind Devonta Smith was Jalen Reagor, who in week 3 against the Dallas Cowboys saw 8 targets, played on the highest percentage of snaps he had on the entire season. He unfortunately followed that up with a poor performance, having 1 target and 1 reception. The Eagles also have 2 very capable tight ends that they use frequently in the passing game with Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, so when it comes to if there's another wide receiver we would start behind Devonta Smith, even though it would be Jalen Reagor if any, we prefer to leave all on the bench. Up next, we have the Green Bay Packers versus the Cincinnati Bengals. This one from a fantasy perspective is probably the most interesting matchup that we've talked about so far. On the Bengals side of things, we have 3 wide receivers we're potentially starting. Jamar Chase and Tyler Boyd, the 2 wide receivers that have been manning down the position since T. Higgins got injured, and the aforementioned T. Higgins, he should be returning from his injury this week. All 3 of them in starter consideration. Higgins, although previously would be ranked as the highest Cincinnati receiver, with it being his first game back from injury, he would be ranked below even Tyler Boyd, ranking 3rd on this team. The only of the 3 receivers we actually have ranked outside the top 30. Still a wide receiver 3 nonetheless, but one that's going to come with a bit more risk than the other 2. Tyler Boyd, one of the higher floor wide receivers, he's going to be ranked just inside the top 30, so a high-end wide receiver 3 as compared to the low-end wide receiver 3 of T. Higgins. As for rookie sensation Jamar Chase, his touchdown streak unfortunately came to an end last week in a very beatable matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, but what's very important is to look at the target market share that he had. In that game, he received 9 targets, the most he had seen all season long, and with him being an exceptional talent, if he's able to retain that type of target market share in this offense, the touchdowns are certainly going to follow suit, so he'll be a high upside option this week. This is a matchup against the Green Bay Packers, one that has one of the highest totals of the week. The Green Bay Packers offensively can compete with the best of them. Consider Jamar Chase a mid-grade to back-end wide receiver 2 in this one, and on the Green Bay side of things, there's really only one wide receiver we can truly trust, and that's Davante Adams. No surprise that we have him not only ranked as a wide receiver 1, but the highest wide receiver in the entire league this week. And as for Randall Cobb, the only other wide receiver we would even consider starting on the Green Bay side of things, he'll be looking to build off of his vintage performance he had in week 4, a game in which he went 5 for 69, even catching 2 receiving touchdowns in the process. While that performance alone could warrant a start, it's the first game that we've actually seen him have an explosion type performance since joining the team again. Preferably, even if I got him off the waivers, I would be looking into starting other options outside of them, options that in 2021 are a bit more of proven products. We all know the dangers of chasing fantasy points, and when it comes to Randall Cobb, even though he's coming off of a really strong performance, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, of course, on the IR. Even with that though, I'd still like to see one more performance out of Randall Cobb before trusting him in my lineup. Moving from a game with one of the highest totals of the week to a game with one of the lowest totals of the week, we have the Houston Texans versus the New England Patriots. When I said low total, I wasn't kidding. We're talking 39.5 points, under 40. We don't see that type of total very often, so you know this game is going to be a shit show offensively. Houston still without a strong option at the quarterback position, and while that typically hasn't hurt the wide receiver 1 in this offense, Brandon Cooks, in this matchup, he'll be hard-pressed to have success. This is, of course, against the New England Patriots, one of the best team at blocking opposing wide receivers. Their strength, not only stopping wide receivers in general, but causing bust games for outside wide receivers is something that they do on a near weekly basis, so Brandon Cooks, while typically going to get a high ranking as a wide receiver 2, this one he's going to be much closer to a high-end wide receiver 3, one with a lower floor than we typically would see from him. As for the New England Patriots though, we basically have the opposite formula. The Houston Texans, while they have actually had pretty good results at stopping wide receivers so far this year, a large part of that is just due to how susceptible they are to being beaten on the ground, so it's basically pick your poison against this defense. Jacoby Jacoby Myers, a wide receiver who has played phenomenally so far for this team with high volume. He's once again going to be a great high floor option in a matchup that's very beatable for him. He still remains scoreless throughout the season and even dating back to last year, so hopefully this can be his first game shaking that. Regardless though, we wouldn't count on it and he doesn't need that to have a strong fantasy day. Start him as a wide receiver 3, start him as one with confidence. And with this matchup being so beatable for the New England Patriots through the air, Nelson Agholor, a wide receiver for New England that we typically wouldn't consider starting, he's going to be an option for desperate owners in the flex position. So if you're in a 14-team league, maybe he's somebody that you can get off the waiver wire that you could put in your lineup this week. But for those of you in 12-team leagues, we mentioned it's more of a desperation flex, so start him at your own risk. He's not going to be an extremely high ceiling option, nor will he come with a high floor either. But even with that said, there still is a world out there where Nelson Agholor leaves this matchup with triple digits in the receiving yards department. An unlikely outcome, but definitely still in his range of outcomes. The Tennessee Titans versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. This is a game where Jacksonville is going to be at home. Even with them being at home though, they're 4.5-point underdogs against the Tennessee Titans, a team that should have AJ Brown back. Unfortunately though, Julio Jones, he is still going to remain out. AJ Brown though in this one, even though it is his first game back returning from injury, not having Julio Jones in the lineup is going to help him have a higher target market share. Consider him a strong wide receiver 1 option, one with an extremely high ceiling. This is of course against the Jacksonville Jaguars, a team that has gotten decimated by other wide receivers throughout the season. Don't let that be an excuse though for you to try to chase fantasy points with Josh Reynolds. Having AJ Brown back in this offense is going to eliminate a lot of the targets that he was seeing last week. In fact, there is no Tennessee Titans wide receiver outside of AJ Brown that we would even trust in this positive matchup. On the Jacksonville Jaguars side of things, as we know, elephant in the room, DJ Chark. During last game, he unfortunately went down with a season-ending injury. His year, it ended in week 4. Fast forward to week 5 though, Laviska Shenault and Marvin Jones, they've had heavy involvement throughout the season already. Marvin Jones specifically, but Laviska Shenault last week did prove to us that he could potentially compete for being the top target in this offense with DJ Chark no longer in the lineup. If we're comparing our expectations though for both receivers, we still do have to give the significant edge to Marvin Jones, who ranks as a wide receiver 2 this week. The Tennessee Titans have allowed the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position on the season, a trend that even dates back to the 2020 season. So Marvin Jones being ranked as a wide receiver 2, he'll certainly come with wide receiver 1 upside. Laviska Shenault, we have him ranked as wide receiver 3, but one that also comes with a high ceiling as well as a safe floor. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Denver Broncos versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. This one actually comes in with the lowest projected total of the week with 39 points. In games like that, you really aren't trying to go out of your way to start players in this matchup, especially ones that aren't typical starters every week. On the Denver side of things, Courtland Sutton, he's been the leading receiver since Jerry Jeudy went down with an injury in week 1. KJ Hamler, one of the backup wide receivers for this team, he's also on the IR. And for that, the target market share, it's pretty consolidated down to Courtland Sutton as well as Tim Patrick. Courtland Sutton in this one though, a game with a very low total. It's hard to expect him to have his best fantasy day, even against a defense that has been getting beaten so far this season. It's strange to hear us say that against a defense like the Pittsburgh Steelers, one that in years past has been very strong, especially recently, but so far in the season they've allowed the 5th most fantasy points to the position. But Courtland Sutton, a player who's been struggling offensively recently due to his recent struggles, we do have to rank him in the wide receiver 3 range, and with a possible bounce back performance against this defense that's been underperforming, we can't say that he has a significantly high floor either. Regardless though, you still could start Tim Patrick. Same thing goes for him though. Can't expect him to have a high floor, somebody we could only trust in the flex, but if they have Courtland Sutton wrapped up, he could be a safe outlet for this team with Drew Lock starting. On the other side of the ball, for the Pittsburgh Steelers, we have Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster. For the first time in a while, all 3 receivers are projected to start. They're of course going to need every possible option offensively to beat this defense that has been performing very well so far this season. The Denver Broncos on the year have been one of the best defenses at defending all positions, let alone wide receivers. So Deontay Johnson, while he typically has had a ton of upside, he is still the favorite to lead this team from a target standpoint, and that does have some value, but each target, since being against this defense, isn't going to be as much as it's worth in other contests. So in this one, trust him as a wide receiver 2, a high floor wide receiver 2, but one that comes with a questionable ceiling. As for Juju Smith-Schuster and Chase Claypool, this could be more of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers effect, and what I mean by that is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have really strong options at wide receiver, but any given matchup, one of those 3 wide receivers could have more success than the other. I think in this one with Chase Claypool and Juju Smith-Schuster, you have a similar type of effect. So while it is tough to pinpoint which wide receiver between Juju and Chase Claypool will end up having the better day, I think you can trust both in the flex, and since most of us don't own both of those Pittsburgh Steelers receivers, you unlikely have to make a choice between starting one or the other. Up next, we have the New Orleans Saints on the road against the Washington Football Team. This is a game with a very low total, coming in with 43 points. The Washington Football Team being 2.5-point home underdogs in this one, so starting with them, we have Terry McLaurin, a bona fide wide receiver 1 on the season. Even with this being a bit of a more difficult matchup than they've seen so far this year, Terry McLaurin's an auto start every week, coming off of his best game of the season where he had 13 targets, 123 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Lock him in, feel pretty good about it. And the only other wide receiver that we would consider starting, Curtis Samuel, a player that we told you not only to take off the waiver wire if available, but to also trade for him if unavailable. And even though we did say those things, and you could assume that that would mean start him in this matchup, with this being a more difficult matchup, with the projected total in this one also being low, Curtis Samuel, a player still recovering from injury, a player who's also on a new team that missed a ton of training camp, we would prefer to leave him on the bench until we see some more proven production out of him. So no other Washington football team receiver are we starting and trusting in our lineup outside of Terry McLaurin. And on the other side of the ball for the New Orleans Saints, Marquez Callaway, a waiver wire sensation himself. He's had some good games, mostly bad games though. Believe it or not though, this defense, the Washington football team defense, one that was very scary heading into this season, has been very lax against opposing wide receivers. Even with that being said though, Marquez Callaway, not a player that I'm willing to trust even in my flex spot. Desperate owners out there, or ones that are in deeper leagues, maybe you have the guts to start him. I certainly don't, nor could I recommend you guys start him if I wouldn't myself. So for New Orleans, there's no wide receivers in this contest I'm trusting in my lineup. But moving into the next one, we have the Detroit Lions versus the Minnesota Vikings. This game has a respectable 49.5 point total. Minnesota in this one, 10-point home favorites. Obviously, with them being 10-point favorites, that's not very conducive to a positive passing game script in the later half of this game. Despite that though, the Detroit Lions have been one of the worst teams at defending opposing wide receivers, so even in a game with a less than positive game script, we're still of course trusting both Adam Thielen and of course Justin Jefferson in this one. Justin Jefferson being the wide receiver 1, Adam Thielen the touchdown-based wide receiver 2. Even with him being touchdown dependent, he'll have a good chance to score against Detroit. But even with that being said, KJ Osborne, the third wide receiver in this offense, even though he did start the year off pretty hot, at this point we can't recommend starting him even in a positive matchup. At this point, if he doesn't perform in this game, I can recommend dropping him to waivers. If there was really good options on the free agent market, I would consider dropping him even before this game. On the other side of the ball, for Detroit, we have Khalif Raymond and Quintez Cephas. On the graphic, you'll notice that we do have both of these wide receivers listed as sit, and if you go to the rankings, you'll notice that we do have them both ranked back to back. So if it comes to a personal preference between the two wide receivers, we don't really have one. Either one of these wide receivers could certainly perform against this passing defense that currently ranks 9th in allowing fantasy points to wide receivers. Despite that though, my level of trust in each one of them though, it's extremely low. And with each receiver having an extremely high chance to bust in this matchup, I would prefer to start other options, higher upside options, even safer floor options, because we all know exactly how much it can hurt if a wide receiver that we start, even if it's in our flex, posts a complete dud. Moving into this next one, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Miami Dolphins. This is another game with an extremely high spread coming in with 9.5 points. Tampa Bay on this one, they're going to be the home favorites. The projected total we have is 48 points. And once again, as with each and every week, all the Tampa Bay wide receivers are in consideration to start and are strong options. We have actually all of them ranked as wide receiver 2s this week. Chris Godwin, the high-end wide receiver 2, Mike Evans, the mid-grade wide receiver 2, and Antonio Brown, the back-end wide receiver 2. The gap between each one of these wide receivers seems to be thinning each and every week. But keep in mind, as I did mention earlier, with them having 3 very strong options at the wide receiver position, we sometimes find ourselves looking after the game, seeing one wide receiver bust, while the other 2 perform greatly. With Tom Brady being able to distribute the ball very effectively, guessing which wide receiver has the best game versus worst game is not as easy as meets the eye. The chance of success would be exactly how we have them ranked. Chris Godwin being the highest chance of success, with Mike Evans coming in 2nd and Antonio Brown in 3rd. All 3 startable options this week. Just keep in mind the Miami defense can be very limiting. On the other side of the ball, for the Miami Dolphins, they have a phenomenal matchup against Tampa Bay that for most of the season so far this year have allowed the most fantasy points to the position. They currently rank 2nd in that area. So despite them having a backup quarterback going into this matchup, the 2 top receivers are certainly in starter consideration. Jalen Waddle, Devontae Parker, both receivers that we do have ranked outside of the top 40, still strong flex options nonetheless. With them being forced to score many points offensively, being against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we would consider both of them more high floor options than high ceiling options, and if preferably, Mike Gesicki would be the only player we start in this matchup. But if you're desperate, maybe you have some injuries, you could certainly do worse in your flex than these Miami receivers. Moving into a matchup that many people consider the most interesting matchup of the week, we have the Cleveland Browns versus the LA Chargers. LA defeating many good teams so far this season. They currently come into this one as 2-point home favorites, which is pretty interesting because the Cleveland Browns typically go into every matchup as favorites. That's making a pretty big statement with the LA Chargers coming into this one as favorites. This one has a 47-point projected total. Both Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, they've been strong options all season. Mike Williams we did see cool off a bit last week. Expectations for him on the year have been pretty lofty, with him starting off the way that he did, scoring 20 plus points in each of his first 3 matchups. But even though he is coming off of his worst performance of this season, we still do feel confidently in his season-long value. Unfortunately though, in this matchup against the Cleveland Browns, a team that has allowed the 5th least fantasy points to the wide receiver position, expecting this game to be his bounce back game, it's not as likely as it would be in a matchup against some weaker pass defenses. Regardless though, we still feel confident in starting him as a wide receiver 2, a high ceiling option at the wide receiver 2 position. If you're looking for a high floor option, Keenan Allen is definitely your guy. We do have him ranked as a wide receiver 2 as opposed to his usual ranking as a wide receiver 1. Once again, that's due to this being a poor matchup, but with him being a consistent option, not only looked at in the red zone, but mainly between the 20s, it's very unlikely that he posts a dud for your team. On the other side of the ball, for the Cleveland Browns, the only real wide receiver we're considering starting is Odell Beckham, who after his first game back, followed that up with a complete dud in a much softer matchup. For that, our expectations in this really poor matchup against the LA Chargers, a team that has allowed the second fewest fantasy points to the position, they're much lower than they would be in a positive matchup. Odell Beckham now proving that he can bust in good situations. How are you going to expect us to put even more faith in him in a matchup where other wide receivers commonly fail? The short answer is we can't, so we have him ranked as a wide receiver 3, and even with him being one of the few talented wide receivers on this team, if I'm an Odell Beckham owner, I could understand leaving him on the bench for more trustworthy options. But if you're looking for other options on the Cleveland side of things, you should look further because there's no other wide receivers on this team that we would consider starting. The next one we have is the Chicago Bears on the road against the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders in this one 5.5 point home favorites in a game that has a 45 point projected total. For the Las Vegas Raiders, they've had multiple wide receivers step up throughout the early weeks. 2 of the options have become trustable in an every week type situation, that being Henry Ruggs, Hunter Renfrow. Bryan Edwards, the 3rd wide receiver in this offense, is a player that we now know should not only be left on the bench but can be dropped to waivers. Even if Bryan Edwards ultimately did outperform both of these wide receivers in this matchup, I still would trust both Hunter Renfrow and Henry Ruggs. I would still trust them over Bryan Edwards even as early as the following week. If you look at our rankings though, Henry Ruggs, he's the wide receiver we have ranked the highest. That factors in the potential upside that he brings to the table, him being a guy that doesn't require a high amount of targets to succeed. Hunter Renfrow, the more safe and consistent option used heavily between the 20s. He's a guy that you can put in your flex spot if you really want to avoid a dud. Just keep in mind with Darren Waller on this team, there's always a chance that one if not both of these receivers could disappoint your lineup, but just due to the recent production we've seen out of them, I feel confident in starting them in the flex. The Chicago Bears have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far this year, and with both of them being heavily involved recently, there's a very low chance of you starting them and them having a disappointing outcome. On the Chicago side of things, both Darnell Mooney and Allen Robinson are going to be ranked as flexes this week. This is going to be one of the softer matchups that they faced all season long, and for those of you wondering who's going to be the starter between Justin Fields, maybe Andy Dalton now that he's healthy, the team has already came out and said that Justin Fields is going to remain the starter. And when it comes to Justin Fields, we've seen very low total volume for this team offensively, very low success for this team offensively as well, which is why we do have Allen Robinson, a receiver that's typically ranked in the wide receiver 2 range, even creeping into the wide receiver 1 range. He's already downgraded all the way to a flex alongside Darnell Mooney, who seems to be the leading receiver in this offense with Justin Fields starting. Even with Mooney being the leading receiver for this team though, the sample that we've had so far has been very low as well, so trusting him, it's not going to be easy. Anybody who starts either of these receivers should lower their expectations. We've seen players like Darnell Mooney prove to have a high ceiling in other matchups, so a high ceiling game, we can't rule it out. It's certainly within the cards. Moving into the next one, we have a divisional matchup, the New York Giants versus the Dallas Cowboys. This game surprisingly has one of the highest totals of the week, coming in with 53 points. Dallas in this one 7-point home favorites, and a large reason to why this total is so high. Clearly with them being 7-point favorites, most of the points offensively are projected to be scored by Dallas. No surprise that both CeeDee Lamb as well as Amari Cooper make phenomenal starts this week. If you own either of them, you're likely willing to start them, and you should start them with confidence. Amari Cooper, though, we still do have ranked as a wide receiver 2. CeeDee Lamb, though, a wide receiver coming off of his worst game of the season, a wide receiver who's been trending downward in each game since opening the season. As the highest targeted receiver in this offense, we still do have a lot of confidence in him, especially to bounce back, and we do expect this matchup be the one that he bounces back in. We have him ranked as a wide receiver 1 this week, and on the other side of the ball, though, it does get a bit confusing. Darius Slayton, Sterling Shepard, they've already been ruled out due to hamstring injuries. In their place, we've seen 3 receivers get targets in this offense, Kenny Golladay being the leading receiver and the highest ranked one we have on the week. Despite this being a very strong matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, we still do have him ranked as a wide receiver 3. We haven't seen the target distribution favor one receiver, which is why Kadarius Toney, the rookie for this team, the first round draft pick. In this matchup against Dallas, we actually do have him ranked as a starter. It may only be as a flex, but he's going to come into this one with an extremely high ceiling. We haven't seen what he can do with a high target market share, and it's very likely that he comes into this one seeing the most targets of his career. With him being a rookie though, and this offense overall being questionable, we can only trust him in the flex. He'll be a low floor flex option, but one that comes with a decent amount of upside. Moving into the next one, we have the San Francisco 49ers against the Arizona Cardinals. In this one, it has a 48.5 point projected total. Arizona playing at home, 5.5 point home favorites. When it comes to the receivers on this team, they have a very similar Tampa Bay type effect, and what I mean by that is they have very many wide receivers that are potential starters. Starting at the top though, DeAndre Hopkins, he's coming back from a rib injury, and we haven't seen his production really reach the same type of heights that we saw it before the injury, so we do only have him ranked as a wide receiver 2. But the 3 other wide receivers potentially in starter consideration, AJ Green, Christian Kirk, Rondale Moore, we've seen one wide receiver step up over the other. That all has depended on the matchup so far. The favorite out of all 3 of those wide receivers to lead this team from receiving has to be AJ Green, or at least he's the favorite to see the most consistent production on the season. He's been the most consistent receiver of the 3, never posting a complete dud game. So for fantasy football, if we're trusting one of those 3 receivers, that would definitely be the guy we choose. But if you need ceiling, Christian Kirk and Rondale Moore, they're both higher ceiling players than that of AJ Green. So if you're facing a strong opponent and you value the ceiling, then maybe one of those wide receivers is an option that you elect to choose. Rondale Moore though, just due to his bustability being much greater than that of Christian Kirk, we do have him ranked a bit lower than Christian Kirk. Both players are going to be flex players, but Rondale Moore, more of a desperation flex if anything. On the other side of the ball for the San Francisco 49ers, as we know, Deebo Samuel, he's been an absolute monster for this team, a bona fide wide receiver 1 stud for this entire season. When it comes to this matchup, even though it's a bit of a more difficult matchup, at least compared to what they've faced so far this year, Deebo Samuel, regardless, is going to be ranked as a wide receiver 1, even with a new quarterback. Brandon Ayuk though, a player who has busted in many games this year, a player who in more matchups than not has busted for your team, even in a game where their offense is going to be forced to put up a lot of points because the Arizona offense usually fires on all cylinders. We still have to recommend preferably leaving him on the bench, only starting him in the flex spot with low expectations, because remember, his involvement has been very spotty and you do have a new quarterback starting. Moving into the second to last matchup, that's going to be the Sunday night matchup, one of the best matchups we could possibly ask for this week. It's the Buffalo Bills on the road against the Kansas City Chiefs, who remain 2-2 on the season. This has a 56 point projected total, and despite the Chiefs being 2-2, they come into this one as 2.5 point home favorites. Oddly enough though, at the wide receiver position, there's nobody outside of Tyreek Hill for Kansas City that we can even trust, not even Mecole Hardman. It's Tyreek Hill, it's Travis Kelce, nobody else outside of that. A bit of a different situation when it comes to the Buffalo Bills, a team that has 3 very capable wide receivers, starting with Stephon Diggs. We have him ranked as a bona fide wide receiver 1. While we haven't seen him hit any of his ceiling games so far this season, he's been a very high floor option. In a game against the Kansas City Chiefs, an offense that will likely force the Buffalo Bills to pull out all cards offensively, Stephon Diggs having a vintage game like we saw from him many times in 2020, it's well within the cards. For similar reasons, we have Emmanuel Sanders, typically ranked as a flex player. He's ranked as a wide receiver 3 in this one, so a bit of an upgrade for him. Cole Beasley, he's a flex player. That's around in which the rank that he usually is, but in this one, he's going to have even much more of a high floor. Moving into the final matchup, a less than exciting matchup, it's going to be the Indianapolis Colts versus the Baltimore Ravens. This one a bit more one-sided. Baltimore in this one, 6.5 point home favorite, so a bit of a more one-sided affair than we've seen in the other matchup. For Baltimore, Marquise Brown, a wide receiver who has posted many wide receiver 1 games this season. He's going to be ranked as a wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 player. While his ceiling will certainly be there, we've seen games recently where he has just dropped passes, not looked like himself, and if that potentially happens in this one against the Indianapolis Colts, ranking him on that borderline wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 range, it's going to be the appropriate expectations we have for him. As for Sammy Watkins, the only other wide receiver in this matchup that we would consider starting, he's a player that you could trust in the flex. Don't forget that the Indianapolis Colts have been beaten very often at the wide receiver position so far. And when it comes to Sammy Watkins, a player who surprisingly on this offense has been playing very consistently throughout the season. Fantasy owners could put him in as a desperation flex. Really wouldn't expect anything more out of him though. And on the other side of the ball for the Indianapolis Colts, they are going to get a tough defensive draw, so Michael Pittman, a player who has been performing consistently as a wide receiver 3, a high floor option. In this one, we do have to downgrade him to more of a flex. His high floor really can't be relied upon or counted on in this matchup, but if you need to start him, he has proven to be the top target in this passing offense in virtually every game this year. Behind him, Zach Pascal. Consider him a high risk flex, not a really high ceiling flex, but if Michael Pittman does end up struggling, the team could rely more on targeting Zach Pascal, so he does have some startability in this one, but with it being a poor matchup, you likely do have better options. But guys, that's going to do it for this one. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.